Imagine a war that spans across centuries. A conflict so unbelievably massive it outlasts empires, survives the dawn of the Industrial Revolution, and bleeds right through two world wars. Sounds like an absolute nightmare, right? Well, today, we're diving into a historical explainer that completely breaks every single rule of international warfare, diplomacy, and honestly, just basic common sense.
So, let's start with a quick question. What do you think is the longest continuously declared war in human history? Now, we've all heard of the 100 Years' War, which, certainly sounds like it should hold the record. Or maybe you're thinking of some ancient generational conflict that stretched on for decades. But the actual answer? It literally dwarfs all of them.
The real answer is a staggering 335 years. Just let that sink in for a second. We are talking about a state of war that lasted over 3 centuries. It is just an unfathomable amount of time for two entities to be locked in a bitter state of hostility.
But here is the massive twist that makes this whole story so fascinating. Over those 335 years of continuous, officially declared conflict, exactly 0 shots were fired. 0 casualties, not a single drop of blood was spilled. It's history's longest war, and yet, weirdly enough, it's also its most peaceful.
So, you're probably wondering, how on earth does a major global superpower officially declare a war and then just forget about it for over 3 centuries? How does a conflict like that stretch all the way into the 1980s without anyone ever pulling a trigger? Well, the answer involves a highly chaotic mix of pirates, a civil war, and one monumental bureaucratic screw-up.
Chapter 1. History's Longest Bloodless War. To understand this anomaly, we need to meet the wildly mismatched belligerents of this bizarre conflict. On one side, we have the Dutch Republic, an absolute juggernaut of a seafaring superpower in early modern Europe. And on the other side, the Isles of Scilly. That's a tiny, tiny cluster of islands located about 45 kilometers off the southwestern tip of Cornwall, England.
Just mapping out this timeline is mind-boggling. The war is officially declared in 1651. 3 years later, a major peace treaty is signed. But the diplomats literally just forgot to include the Isles of Scilly in the paperwork. That single, careless clerical error created a diplomatic void that sat wide open until 1986.
But before we get to how it finally ended, we absolutely have to ask, how did a remote, tiny archipelago end up single-handedly taking on the massive Dutch naval fleets in the first place? To figure that out, we have to travel back in time to the incredibly violent collapse of the English monarchy.
Part 2. Pirates, Parliament, and Royalists. The spark for this entire mess was actually the English Civil War, raging between the parliamentarians, led by Oliver Cromwell, and the Royalists who were loyal to the crown. By 1648, Cromwell's new model army had basically crushed all Royalist land resistance across mainland Britain. The very last Royalist stronghold in Cornwall had just fallen.
Completely backed into a corner, the remnants of the Royalist Navy desperately retreated to the Isles of Scilly. The Royalist governor, a guy named Sir John Granville, effectively turned the islands into a heavily fortified pirate base. Operating out of places like Star Castle, his privateers started relentlessly attacking passing merchant ships just to fund their exiled king. And the Dutch merchant fleet, they were taking massive financial hits from this.
Naturally, the Dutch Republic, who happened to be allied with Cromwell's parliamentarians, were not going to put up with these losses. So in March 1651, they dispatched a heavy-hitting naval squadron, a dozen warships, under the command of Lieutenant Admiral Martin Tromp. He anchored right off the Isles of Scilly with one very clear business-driven goal: demand immediate financial reparations for all his plundered ships.
Now you can probably guess how negotiations went with a desperate group of cornered, heavily armed privateers. The Royalists were utterly broke, and they flat-out refused to pay compensation, or even acknowledge the damage they'd caused, for that matter. So here is Admiral Tromp, sitting there with a dozen warships, a mandate to protect Dutch trade, and a gang of rogue privateers essentially laughing in his face. What's his next move?
Chapter 3. A Forgotten Declaration. Well, Admiral Tromp decides to escalate. According to historical records, on April 17, 1651, Tromp legally declared war. But there was a catch. Because the Dutch were firmly allied with the parliamentarian government controlling the English mainland, Tromp couldn't just declare war on England. Instead, he legally restricted his declaration specifically and exclusively to the Isles of Scilly.
But ironically, this hyper-localized war ended almost as soon as it started.
Literally months later, in June 1651, parliamentarian forces under Admiral Robert Blake launched a massive siege on the islands. Facing Blake's forces on land and Tromp's blockade at sea, the Royalists caved and surrendered. With the pirate threat totally neutralized, the Dutch fleet quietly hoisted their sails and just went home to the Netherlands. They never fired a single shot.
Okay, so here is where the bureaucratic catastrophe actually happens. A few years down the line, the First Anglo-Dutch War breaks out, and it's eventually resolved by the 1654 Treaty of Westminster. But when the diplomats sat down to draft the peace terms, they were entirely focused on the big players, the sovereign nations. Since the Isles of Scilly were no longer a rogue, independent pirate haven, their specific little state of war from 1651 was just completely forgotten, left out of the treaty entirely.
It was a localized declaration of war, completely swallowed up by the paperwork of time. The Stuart Restoration came and went. The Industrial Revolution changed the world. Multiple world wars were fought. So, how long would this forgotten state of belligerency sit buried in the dusty archives of Europe before someone realized that the Netherlands and this tiny English island were technically still locked in mortal combat?
This brings us to Chapter 4, the 1986 Peace Treaty. Let's fast forward an unbelievable 334 years to 1985. A local Scilly historian named Roy Duncan actually wrote a letter to the Dutch embassy, basically just asking if the old local legends were true and if they were still at war. And to everyone's absolute shock, the embassy checked their records and confirmed, yep, no peace treaty had ever been signed.
Seeing a brilliant PR opportunity for some historical fun, Duncan invited the Dutch ambassador out to the islands. And on April 17, 1986, which is exactly 335 years to the day after Admiral Tromp's initial declaration, Ambassador Jonkheer Rijn Hoytekaper arrived on the Isles of Scilly. He signed an official peace treaty, finally putting an end to the longest war in human history.
The whole ceremony was a massive success, full of lighthearted humor. In fact, Ambassador Hoytekaper famously joked during the signing, saying, "It must have been harrowing to the Scillonians to know we could have attacked at any moment." It was just a perfect, charming display of modern symbolic diplomacy, resolving a centuries-old ghost in the machine.
But as we pull back the curtain on this incredible historical explainer, we really have to ask the critical question that legal scholars absolutely love to debate. Was this even a real war to begin with? Did this 335 years state of hostility hold any actual legitimate weight under international law? Or is it basically just a highly successful tourist legend?
Chapter 5. Was it even legal? The academic debate around the 335 Years' War is deeply fascinating, mostly because it forces us to look at how nations historically defined sovereign authority and where they drew the legal boundaries of warfare.
The main objection from legal scholars centers on the concept of jus ad bellum, which is the right to go to war. Under the international frameworks that were emerging at the time, an individual military commander like Admiral Tromp didn't actually have the constitutional authority to declare a sovereign war on behalf of the Dutch States General. His commission was really just to demand reparations, definitely not to kick off a centuries-long international conflict.
On top of that, the Isles of Scilly were a subnational, dependent territory of England. They weren't an independent sovereign state, and international law fundamentally just does not recognize a declaration of war by a sovereign nation against the tiny piece of another nation's land. Plus, later on, sweeping treaties between England and the Netherlands would have implicitly canceled out any localized disputes anyway. But you know what makes this whole thing so captivating? The Scilly situation isn't actually entirely unique in the history of diplomatic blind spots. Just consider a few other historical comparisons. During the Peninsular War, the tiny Spanish town of Huescar declared war on Denmark in 1809 and literally forgot about it for 172 years until they made a symbolic peace in 1981. Or take the Pig War of 1859 between the US and Britain, which was triggered because a farmer shot a pig, leading to a 13-year diplomatic standoff. These bureaucratic anomalies really do happen.
So, as we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a thought to chew on. We tend to view international borders, declarations of war, and peace treaties as absolute, concrete realities. But the 335 Years' War reveals that our geopolitical landscape is often held together by fragile paperwork, clerical errors, and centuries-old administrative oversights. It really makes you wonder, what other forgotten wars are currently hiding in the dusty archives of history?